Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday the 27th of May. I'm Fraser Nelson, your host for today's show. Now, we've got several things lined up tonight. The first is Joe Biden's investigation into the origins of the COVID leak. Might it have come from a Wuhan lab after all? We talked to Matt Ridley, who's written the cover story on this for us. Then Dominic Cummings. What's the damage report from his explosive revelations in Westminster this week? We speak to James Forsyth, Katie Balls and Craig Oliver, Cameron's former spin doctor. Then we talk to Professor Sunetra Gupta. Dominic Cummings said in testimony that she'd advocated a herd immunity strategy. Does she agree with his assessment? Then over to Belarus, where we're going to be asking Owen Matthews what to make of the extraordinary decision to forcibly land a Ryanair jet and march off it a Belarusian dissident. And then finally, is Sweden ready for a woke monarchy? Lisa Bjurwald looks at developments over there and asks if Prince Harry is more of a pioneer than a pariah. Now, first, before we do this, we'd like to make what is if you ask me, a financially unsensible special offer. We're going to be offering a £20 Amazon voucher to anybody who takes over a £12 subscription to The Spectator, a trial subscription for 3 months. 3 months of the magazine, 3 months online, all for £12, and you get 20 quid from Amazon. That's on spectator.co.uk/TV offer. And now onto our first item. When Matt Ridley first heard the theory that COVID was actually cooked up in a Chinese laboratory, he dismissed it as being a conspiracy theory on the lines of UFO landings and Elvis still being alive. But after a year looking into it, he thinks there's a lot more to this theory, perhaps why Joe Biden has now instructed the American intelligence services to reopen their investigation into what previously had seemed to be a Donald Trump conspiracy madness. He joins me now. Matt, thanks very much for your cover piece. Why did you start looking into this? Because for a long time, nobody sensible thought this made sense.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, I started out from the assumption that Mother Nature's a better genetic engineer than we are, and so it would be hard. We'd be hard put in a lab to come up with something this infectious, this efficient, this lethal. And then, as I began to look into it, I started interviewing scientists for an article in the Wall Street Journal about the origin of the virus and the bats and the pangolins and all that kind of stuff as it was emerging in the spring of 2020. And I could, it was clear that it didn't quite add up, and some of them was saying, well, don't worry, it will add up. But the market theory began to collapse, and then in May 2020, two things happened. One, a paper came out from a scientist named Alina Chan and her colleagues in Boston, saying this virus was very well adapted to human cells from the very beginning. That's unlike SARS, which took months to evolve rapidly to become a good at infecting people. And the other thing that happened that same week was the head of the Chinese CDC said, we've tested all the animals in the market and they're all negative. Now, that was very quietly announced. They didn't want that news to be a big splash. But you put those two together and you say, well, hang on, if it didn't come out the market and it was well adapted to human beings from the start, maybe it's been playing around in human cells in the lab. And then one started looking into the labs in Wuhan and what they were doing and finding that actually, of all the cities in the world, this is the one that has been studying bat coronaviruses more than any other laboratory on the entire planet. And it has been collecting thousands of samples, and the nearest relative, which was collected by the scientists from this lab, was collected from more than 1,200 miles away by road during one of 7 collecting trips to one particular mine shaft, and that in the months afterwards, more and more attempts were made to find closely related viruses, and none have been as close as that one collected by the scientists and brought to the laboratory. So for me, it was very much a journey of discovery.
Right, but surely if you're doing research into that, you would take all sorts of precautions. If the American government itself is sending millions of American taxpayer dollars onto this, they will be pretty sure that these will be done in a controlled way. I mean, nuclear energy is very dangerous, but all precautions are made to make sure it doesn't seep out. surely the Chinese would have that covered. The idea that you might just wander home with a new pathogen capable of killing millions, I mean, surely precautions would have been taken, and the American authorities would have to be confident that those precautions were being taken. Otherwise, they wouldn't fund the program in the first place.
Well, very interestingly, in 2018, the American embassy in Beijing sent a delegation to Wuhan to look at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, specifically to look at its biosecurity level 4 lab, which is the highest biosecurity level. That's the one which you do Ebola research in. Funnily enough, SARS does not require BSL-4, it requires BSL-3. And they made several suggestions about how this wasn't being, the safety and security procedures were not good enough and ought to be improved. This was China's only and first biosecurity level 4 lab was in Wuhan at this institute. Now, as I say, they were doing experiments in BSL-3 on SARS itself, but the bat viruses, the ones they were collecting in the wild from bats, which were not very good at infecting people, most of them, they were doing that at biosecurity level 2. And that was what the international rules said, by the way. Now, in BSL-4, you're in a spacesuit, you're breathing through an air tube, there's positive pressure in your suit so that you can't, if you puncture it, nothing comes in. BSL-3, it's not quite like that. You are at least breathing the air, but you are totally enclosed in a suit, and you're working within a sealed cabinet, which is negative pressure. BSL-2, you're just wearing goggles, a mask, and a lab coat. That's it. Nothing else.
Right, so this sounds like you paint a picture, I guess a plausible picture, of a sort of Chernobyl-style disaster, and the history of everything from the Titanic sinking onwards. You've the best-laid security plans of mice, men, and nuclear scientists go aft agley. But surely what you're missing, right now, it still is just that. It's a theory. All you're saying effectively is it could have come from a lab. Sure, nobody denies that. But whether it did come from a lab, the best evidence you've got is that we have not yet identified the missing link that we found with SARS-1. In other words, they managed to get to the original bat cave. They managed to connect the dots between animals and human the first time around. Nobody's managed to connect the dots between animals and humans this time around. And that you're saying, well, what about a lab leak? Sure, it's plausible, but it's not conclusive. The Chinese government still describe this as absolutely crazy to fan up racial discrimination and xenophobia. When this was mentioned back in April, the Washington Post described it as a conspiracy theory. The New York Times said it was a fringe theory. The Lancet has already published a statement by several scientists condemning conspiracy theories suggesting COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. So surely a great many people, including very esteemed scientists, have dismissed this theory as bunkum.
Well, that is changing. A year ago, a great many scientists, as you say, signed up to this view that it was a conspiracy theory and a fringe idea. And the problem was Donald Trump was in favour of this idea, and that made it automatically anathema to a lot of people. But they confused two things. One was the deliberate bioweapon synthetic virus idea, and the other was handling viruses in the laboratory in an accident. And frankly, the latter has always been much more plausible. You're seeing a lot of scientists now climbing back off over the fence to say, actually, we realise that this is possible. One of the signatories of that letter in the Lancet that you mentioned has said, I think it needs to be investigated. One of the authors of a key paper called The Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2, which was a very influential paper in March last year, has now said he thinks it deserves to be investigated. So more and more scientists have now changed their view and said, yes, it does need to be investigated. But you are right that we have no direct proof of a lab leak. There's no record of an incident. And more importantly, there's no record of this particular virus being experimented on. Now, you might, the Wuhan Institute of Virology says, look, if we'd had this virus in the lab, we'd have published it. Well, would you? In February last year, they published the virus, the genome of the virus that was closest related to this, and they'd had that since 2013. So they don't publish things immediately. They had a database with 22,000 entries in it, 15,000 of which were about bat viruses. They were both data on where it was collected, but also genome sequences and partial genome sequences. Now that database, 22,000 items, went offline on the 12th of September 2019, before the pandemic began. And they've come up with all sorts of excuses why they won't share now what was in it. They say, well, there are hacking attempts to it. Well, all the more reason to show legitimate inquiries what's in that database. Also, when they published that related virus, that's the closest relative of SARS-CoV-2, in February last year, they disguised its origin, changed its name, did not mention the fact that 3 people had died in the mine shaft where it was collected, and didn't say that they'd found 8 other similar viruses at the same time. Now, that is not the behaviour of a group that thinks it's innocent. Now, it says it's innocent, and the Chinese government says it couldn't have come out of the lab, but in that case, be transparent, open your books, show us what you've got, and we will no doubt be utterly convinced.
Well, that question of innocence, and I guess the question of who done it, is the cover of this week's Spectator. Matt Ridley's article is there. Matt, thanks very much for joining us on Spectator TV. Now we're going to the other big story of this week, Dominic Cummings' explosive revelations in Westminster, where he had plenty to say about the Prime Minister and how a delay in lockdown, he says, led to thousands of deaths. I'm joined by Katie Bowles, James Forsyth, and by Craig Oliver, who was David Cameron's spokesman in Number 10 for a while. Thank you all for joining me. Craig, let's start with you. You were Dominic Cummings' adversary for a while in the Brexit campaign. What do you think he's up to, and how do you gauge his sort of behaviour at the moment?
I think it's very complicated, and I think that is the biggest theme of this. Dominic Cummings is a genius in terms of campaigning. He's very, very good at making things very binary, black or white, hero, villain, up or down. And I think you sort of saw yesterday the tragedy of somebody who has portrayed the world in that way and often seen the world in that way, dealing with the fact that actually in reality it's quite complicated, it's messy, it's difficult, there are flawed human beings, there's imperfect information, and then as a result of that, chaos ensues. And I think that there was a real tension between him wanting to have a kind of perfect dynamic and the reality of a complicated and difficult situation, and he just seemed not to be able to just see that.
James, what do you think what do you think were the most damaging revelations that we heard in this sort of 6-7 hour evidence session from Dominic Cummings?
Well, I think the most damaging one is the idea that tens of thousands of people have died who needn't have died because of mistakes that the government has made. I mean,
specifically delaying lockdown. That's the big. That is the arch mistake.
To his mind, it is the delay in locking down in both March and in the autumn that are responsible for that.
Right. And do you think that, take Matt Hancock, he was the number one target. What is, Katie, do you think Matt Hancock's future is now? Is he now a dead man walking?
In a strange way, actually having a series of damaging allegations and Dominic Cummings' claim that you should have been sacked by now for 15 to 20 reasons could be helpful to Matt Hancock, in the sense that there has been talk for some time that Downing Street would like to move Matt Hancock, maybe even Matt Hancock would like to lead the health brief. But I think were Boris Johnson to move now on that, it could look as though he was listening to what Dominic Cummings was saying, that Dominic Cummings had a point. And Number 10 don't want to say Dominic Cummings has a point about anything, because then they might have a point about the Prime Minister. So perhaps now it's actually harder to move Matt Hancock.
Right. Now, one of the most interesting clips was when Dominic Cummings said that he had personally lost faith in Boris Johnson and, as a result, created a mechanism to get around it. Here's what he had to say.
By the 31st of October, our relations were essentially already finished. The fact that his girlfriend also wanted rid of me was, relevant, but not the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem was, fundamentally, I regarded him as unfit for the job, and I was trying to create a structure around him to try and stop what I thought were extremely bad decisions and push other things through against his wishes. And he had the view that he was Prime Minister and I should just be doing as he wanted me to, and that's obviously not sustainable for very long.
So, Craig, what did you think about that? It stretches the powers of an advisor somewhat, doesn't it?
I think it does, and I think that this is another problem for Dominic Cummings that he perhaps hadn't spotted. He has a bit of a credibility problem here. He was briefing very, very hard that he was effectively the most powerful person in the country. He made very clear that he was only taking the job on the understanding that he had complete control and the ability to do that. He said that on the record. He was very, very clear about that. And I think coming up afterwards as well and saying, oh, look, I've only just realised that Boris Johnson isn't the master of detail and sometimes changes his mind on things. Well, come on. We've known this guy for a long time. We all knew who he was. We know how he was when he was Mayor of London. We know how he was when he was working for the Spectator and the Telegraph and whatever. And people know this information. So for Dominic Cummings to come out and say, only under this pressure did I realise who I was actually working with, it just really stretches credibility a bit much, I think.
Right. And James, how powerful was Dominic Cummings? It wasn't quite clear. He was saying he was an advisor to the Prime Minister. That was it. He basically says he lost the argument about lockdown several times. So it didn't sound, from all the apologies he was making yesterday, as if he was that powerful. So was he exaggerating how powerless he was? Or when he was in office, were people exaggerating how powerful he was?
So Dominic Cummings made this point when he said, his ability to affect change in Downing Street was limited. He pointed out how he had wanted to kind of reorganise where everyone sat, and that he said that he hadn't been able to achieve that. But at another point in his testimony, he talked about bringing in Simon Case to be the cabinet secretary. Now, Simon Case is very young, and him getting the job was that was a sign of a change to the kind of the classic civil service processes. I think that Dominic Cummings was a very powerful figure in Downing Street, but he was not the Prime Minister. And I think ultimately, in some ways, that was where some of the tension in yesterday's testimonies came from, which is, that Dominic Cummings could get his way on anything where Boris Johnson did not actively disagree with him. And there were undoubtedly some decisions on when to lock down where Boris Johnson actively disagreed with him, and that was why he wasn't getting his way. But I think his writ ran up to the point where it conflicted with that of Boris Johnson, who was, after all, the Prime Minister.
And Katie, is there now a Dominic Cummings-sized hole in number 10? If you look at how he described his role yesterday, he was putting together meetings, he drawing a plan B on a blackboard, convening people. It seems that he was, certainly by his own admissions, and pretty powerful. So what's happened now in number 10? Is there somebody else coordinating it, or is there just drift?
Well, I think there was a revealing moment in Dominic Cummings' testimony when he talked about how he thought about leaving his job a few times, and at one point has said to the Prime Minister, well, look, you're more scared of me than the chaos you get without me. And he alleges that Boris Johnson replied saying, well, chaos isn't so bad. When you have a chaotic situation, everyone looks to me. And I think that's interesting if you think about recent events in number 10, some of which involved briefing against Dominic Cummings when they've been roused, and lots of people saying who is in charge other than Boris Johnson. And I don't think there's a specific aide now who is seen as the most senior. Yes, you've got Dan Rosenfield, who is technically the chief of staff, but I don't think there is that heavyweight figure in the way that Dominic Cummings was. But also, perhaps that is what Boris Johnson wants.
Now, Craig, Dominic Cummings says he now thinks the Prime Minister is not fit for office. It's reasonable to assume that he's going to be making more interventions, perhaps aimed at removing that Prime Minister from office, or certainly destabilising him within it. Do you think he'll be successful in that campaign? Because after all, he campaigned against you during the referendum and he got the better of you. Might he get the better of Boris Johnson now?
No, he certainly did, and it was highly effective, and it worked very well. I'm sort of reminded of that sort of line in King Lear where he's raging in the storm and he's saying, I shall do such things I know not what. We've sort of heard this raging quite a lot. There's been a number of occasions where Dominic Cummings has said that he's going to reveal a whole load of stuff. There was a whole load of briefing to the Sunday papers about what we were going to discover and that kind of thing. And ultimately, I think it's falling short. The reality is it was incredibly fascinating to watch yesterday, but in reality, what it delivered was a lot of colour and not really much that was substantially new. We knew that there was a scandal about what happened in care homes in this country. We knew that there was a huge row about whether or not there should be a second lockdown. And I think most people know and feel that, yes, we did lock down too late. But just going back to the point that Katie was making, this is a government, if we're honest, that is riding high despite everything else. It is doing incredibly well in the polls. It did very well in the last election, and it did that without Dominic Cummings. So that's an interesting factor to take on board as well.
Right, but James, what we didn't know was we didn't know that the Health Secretary was so mistrusted by the Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary was saying Matt Hancock is a congenital liar. I can't trust him. We didn't know that Boris Johnson told Dominic Cummings that that Matt Hancock is the sort of person you keep in his job now so you can fire him later. Now, surely these revelations do move the dial in Westminster.
Yeah, I think as Katie has said on Coffee House, one of the things that Dominic Cummings' testimony will do is stir up tensions and trouble within the cabinet and within Downing Street, because you are revealing an awful lot about what people said behind closed doors about their colleagues and the like. And so I think that will undoubtedly be true. I think one of the challenges for Dominic Cummings is that in his evidence yesterday, he was trying to make two separate cases that slightly cut against each other. One is that the whole system failed, and the other is that the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary aren't up to the job. I mean, the problem with that is if you basically emphasise all the deficiencies in the system, people think, oh, well, it wouldn't have made that much difference who the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary were if that was the problem. And if you tell people that the problem is that the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary aren't up to the job they're doing, people think, well, maybe if the system had been led better, it would have worked. And I think Craig talked about how the clarity that Dominic Cummings brings to campaigns. I think one of the problems for his argument yesterday was that it wasn't a simple either it's the system's fault or it's the Prime Minister's fault. He was arguing it was a mix of the two, and that's a more difficult and nuanced case to make.
And Craig Oliver, would you go back into number 10 now? Is there anything that could persuade you? Because it sounds like Boris Johnson needs help.
I don't think he'd have me. I think he needs somebody who was much more in line with his current thinking. And I think actually, you know what, at the bottom end of all of this, I think that probably in number 10, they're not comfortable. They haven't enjoyed what's gone on in the last day or so. But actually, in reality, I think they've seen that Dominic Cummings has shot his bolt. And actually, the world didn't end, the sky did not fall in. What will be much more interesting is as we get out of lockdown and end up in a situation where we realise, there are huge NHS waiting lists, public services under pressure, does that really have an impact on the government? And then this kind of stuff starts getting real traction at those moments. At the moment, vaccination programmes going brilliantly. We seem to be doing a lot better than other countries. It's not gaining traction. It might do in a few months' time, but at the moment I think they'll be fairly confident that they've seen off Dominic Cummings for the time being.
Well, plenty challenges ahead. Thank you, Craig. And also, as it says in King Lear, the plague of our times is when madmen lead the blind. Katie and James, thanks very much for that. And now we'd like to move on to something else Dominic Cummings said yesterday. He should have resigned in September, he said, after his advice to have a circuit-breaking lockdown was rejected. He said the Prime Minister had started to listen to experts other than those in the SAGE committee. Here's what he had to say.
Then on the Sunday evening, there was a meeting with a combination of SAGE scientists and some external people. By this point, unfortunately, the Prime Minister was listening to various people who were saying things like, there's already herd immunity in the population, there won't be any second wave, etc., etc. So we had this meeting in the Cabinet Room Sunday evening. Patrick and Chris gave their view. A guy called Hennigan and a woman from Oxford called Professor Gupta, I think it was, gave the kind of don't lock down view. John Edmonds said, who was on SAGE, surely we're going to learn the lessons of March. Here's what the data's going to be. You are not going to. The only logic of not doing a lockdown then will be that you're not going to do it at all. There's no way that you're going to make that decision. Just do it now, otherwise it's all going to be worse. The Prime Minister said, I'm not persuaded of that.
I'm delighted to have one of those experts joining us now. Sunetra Gupta is Professor of Theoretical Epidemiology at the University of Oxford. Thanks very much for joining us on Spectator TV. So what did you make of Dominic Cummings' account of what you and other outsiders said to the Prime Minister when you were called in last September?
I mean, first of all, in general, I would say it is unfortunate that the level of discourse surrounding all of this has settled into a kind of personal harangue and a rant and accusations, fingers of blame being pointed here and there. What I'd always hoped we would achieve is a measured debate with different sides being presented. Now, instead, what's happened and what we've had to endure, and which has it caused enormous damage to science, is this kind of partisan debate with people blaming each other constantly, and we've had to suffer a misrepresentation of our ideas. So, for example, when Dominic Cummings said that or I had said that we had hit the herd immunity threshold, this could not be further from the truth. All along, my position, and it remains so, is that we cannot reliably calculate a herd immunity threshold for SARS-CoV-2, and also that this threshold fluctuates due to seasonality. But putting those two ideas together, you can explain what has happened in this country and many other countries, including India, as a kind of interaction between the level of immunity that's acquired already in the population and where the herd immunity threshold is at, depending on the season.
Right.
But we never said that we were at herd immunity. Okay, so that's one point.
Yeah, and I think actually we've got the written evidence which you gave to that, and in that written evidence you say quite clearly that it's not. That the funny thing about COVID is that you can't tell when you're at herd immunity. But what was the overall? I mean, right now at that meeting, it was rare that people like you, Carl Hannigan. Was Dominic Cummings correct to say that you were saying in effect, "Don't lock down now"?
Oh yes, I think that would be a correct representation. But that "don't lock down now" was not in response, not because we had already reached herd immunity and therefore didn't need to worry about a resurgence. "Don't lock down now" was all about whether lockdown is the appropriate response and whether more lives would not have been saved by employing a complete or a different strategy, which focused on where protection was focused on those who were vulnerable.
But of course, your proposal, the Great Barrington Declaration, effectively said that the restrictions should be centred, or protection, as you put it, should be centred on people who are older and vulnerable and not on the younger. So you were surely advocating exactly the same thing. Let younger people, let the key workers, if you want, go into society, basically let them get infected. And this was, I put to you, a herd immunity strategy, and calling it any other name is surely semantic deception.
No, I think that, first of all, I don't think we should even use the term herd immunity strategy, because herd immunity is not a strategy. It's, if you like, it's part of our toolkit in trying to live with infectious diseases. So we should be thinking, about how we can develop herd immunity without paying that price. And of course, vaccination is one of the routes that we can do that, although whether COVID vaccines will allow us to reach herd immunity is another matter completely. What we were advocating was, in fact, to shield the essential workers who were at risk of dying from COVID, those who had comorbidities. So what we did was we locked up the university students. So I think there were strategies that we could have put in place which would have protected those who were actually at risk of death, while allowing those who weren't at significant risk of death to conduct their lives normally and be protected from other forms of death and deficits to their welfare, and which at the same time would lead, as it has actually done, to the growth of herd immunity in the population. This is, for some reason, people are in denial of the fact that actually at the moment, one of the reasons we are enjoying the situation we currently have is because there has been a substantial build-up of herd immunity in the population.
But you still find yourself in a minority voice among scientists, don't you? I mean, we heard from Neil Ferguson at Imperial College only earlier today, where he basically was saying that the decision to delay lockdown by a week cost 20,000 lives. Now, that's just not him saying it from the top of his head. Several people, very well-regarded experts at Imperial, produced a piece of work last December making that exact calculation, that knowing what we know now from lockdown, delaying it by even a week, as the Prime Minister did in March when he wasn't listening to Dominic Cummings, led to a death toll 20,000 higher than it would otherwise have been. That's a scientific paper, surely.
I don't believe in those results. I think that you can make a mathematical model in which you embed a certain assumption, and then from that assumption you get a certain result. And I don't think that that was a correct result. Furthermore, what we suggested, I think, would have saved more lives. So it's not as if we suggested that you should do nothing. If you did nothing, there would be possibly a tangible difference between going into lockdown. At least lockdown perhaps saves certain lives. But what we suggested was going into a situation where we protected those who might die and allowed those who wouldn't die to continue with their lives and to prevent the collateral damage that lockdown inevitably incurs.
Right, but your theory is based on several assumptions. Now, I put to you that everybody got things wrong, but you included. I mean, quite often during the summer, it was said that you had, for example, said that herd immunity was achieved last March, and also I think you said in an interview that the fatality ratio would be closer to 1 in 10,000 than 1 in 1,000. Those things weren't true, were they?
First of all, with regard to herd immunity, I don't think, as I said before, and I keep saying, I don't think we know what level of herd immunity was achieved in May. I can easily write down a mathematical model in which a high degree of herd immunity or a large number of people were already protected from infection in May. Of course, the herd immunity threshold itself dropped because of the summer, and so I would posit that it was immunity in the population that kept surges from occurring through the summer. Now, my colleagues would disagree with me and say, no, it was social distancing that kept numbers down.
But why would it come back in the autumn? I don't understand. If herd immunity kept it down in the summer, then why would we see the second wave and arguably the third wave when the Kent variant came along?
First of all, I did say in several interviews that we would expect a winter surge. The typical pattern of these respiratory infections is that the herd immunity threshold itself changes with time. So in the summer you have a low threshold of herd immunity. So even if 25% of the population happen to be immune, that is sufficient to prevent the increase in infections. As the temperature drops and other conditions change, that immunity threshold starts to creep up. And that's why you inevitably will get a winter surge, an autumn surge, and possibly a spring surge. These are all things that I said in various interviews. Not surprisingly, people who choose to discredit me pick out one or two quotations out of context, which imply that I thought the epidemic was over, the pandemic was over. Now, all I can say to you is, if I thought the pandemic was over, would I have spent the next 6 months trying to come up with a strategy to handle a resurgence of this pandemic?
And what about the fatality rate? I mean, what's your estimate of that now?
Okay, the fatality rate, yes, that was definitely careless of me to say that 1 in 1,000 or 10,000 is what the average infection fatality rate is. The truth is that a mean infection fatality rate is not a very sensible number to think about.
Because it was a global figure, isn't there, and a national figure. I mean, there is some stage where, on a global basis, it can be different to what it is in a country where the virus is trying to be controlled.
No, in a country where the age distribution is different, where the comorbidity distribution is different, you will get a much, much lower average infection fatality rate. But because infection fatality rate is not a fundamental property of a country, or the virus itself, it's a property that relates to the host, age and condition. I think what I was overzealously trying to draw attention to was the fact that most of us have a very, very low likelihood of dying from infection unless we are old, frail, or have certain comorbidities. But certainly, I absolutely should not have put that number out there.
Right, sure.
As a mean IFR, that's not correct.
But overall, listening to the 7 hours of Dominic Cummings' evidence, seeing a world's worth of experiments and lockdowns, and also we've got places like America where Texas took a very different response than California, and they had sort of comparable levels of COVID. What do we think? The jury obviously is out in lockdowns. But seeing what we see now, do you think that Dominic Cummings is quite clear in saying that the delay in acting hard and acting early cost tens of thousands of lives? Are you saying that you are pretty sure that he is still incorrect in that view?
I think he's incorrect. But what's really important here is that nobody should be saying anything with certainty. And the beauty of our focus protection plan is that it is robust to all these uncertainties. Regarding these uncertainties, academics should be having respectful and discussions, debates, which has not been permitted really in this whole saga. But really what should be happening is Neil Ferguson and I should be having a publicised debate where we present our assumptions, talk about our solutions, and come up. Maybe we won't agree. We will respectfully agree to disagree at the end of it. What we've been trying to do is come up with a plan that is robust to these uncertainties, and that is focus protection is such a plan. And the beauty of it now is that the vaccines allow us to deliver focus protection without getting into further debates about how do we actually implement it, how do we actually ask people to self-isolate over a period of time when the risk is high, how do we separate people in multi-generational households, all important problems to which I think there were answers. But now we have a vaccine, which makes it really easy to deliver focus protection. So I think this whole business of being certain, and particularly among people who aren't experts in the field, to have this certainty and exhibit this rage based on a certainty, it mystifies me. I would not have thought this was how a civilized society operates.
Well, you certainly have been a victim of this rage, Professor Gupta, and I wonder at times what on earth inspired you to go against the consensus in the way that you did in an atmosphere where dissenting voices are hounded out. And indeed, there was a campaign to discredit you pretty much run by a Tory MP, Neil O'Brien, who was after you. Did you not at times think, why did I bother? Shouldn't I have taken the more comfortable life? I imagine things have been pretty tough at times for you over the summer. I would be surprised if there hasn't been some campaign to get you to resign from university or something like that.
Well, yes, of course it's been very tough. I mean, but the truth is that I do feel I have a responsibility as a scientist and a citizen, as a global citizen, and I do feel very strongly, that was where I started and that's where I remain, that the collateral damage from lockdowns is profound, and in its final tally, we will be realising that this is just not an appropriate tool, that we have harmed young people, children, and those on low incomes, particularly people in developing countries, to an extent that makes this lockdown is just not an appropriate tool. And that's why we try to come up with other tools that might be appropriate. And I still believe that focus protection is one of those. And now that we have a vaccine, it's possible to deliver that focus protection. And I think that's what we should get on with, rather than trying to blame people. And
Professor Gupta, thanks very much indeed. Well, the Cummings show distracted attention from a rather important conflagration in the continent. A Ryanair flight left Greece on the way to Vilnius, but ended up making a detour via Belarus, where it was landed after fighter jets sent by the Belarusian government, who marched off a dissident who was thereby arrested. So what can we do about this rather extraordinary new practice of what Ryanair called a new form of piracy, plucking dissidents from the sky? Owen Matthews in this week's magazine asks how you can solve a problem like Vladimir Putin, who is, with his ally Alexander Lukashenko, acting in ways which do challenge the Western norms. Owen, thanks for joining us. So what can we do, if anything, about the newly resurgent and assertive Putin?
Well, we should actually draw a distinction. Is that actually with this particular outrage, unlike all the other outrages, unlike the shooting down of a Malaysian airliner, unlike the poisoning of the Skripals, unlike the election hacking, this one was actually not Putin. It was Lukashenko, and interestingly, Putin's media have actually, there hasn't been any clear condemnation from the Kremlin, but Putin's media have actually been quite critical of Lukashenko for his irresponsibility. So, I mean, that said, your question stands, what can we do, whether it's the Lukashenko hijacking a Ryanair flight, or whether it's murderers at loose with chemical weapons in Salisbury. And so far, the best thing that we've come up with, or the West has come up with, is sanctions. And frankly, I think it's pretty clear that those have failed to dissuade him, because there have been rounds of sanctions, multiple rounds since 2012. So personal sanctions, economic sanctions, cutting off the ability of Russian companies to raise capital, restricting the ability of Russia to sell its treasury bonds, and so on and so forth. But so far, none of those have worked, because they are not designed to be fatal to the regime. And this is really the key question, is when you're sanctioning a regime, are you into regime change, or are you into basically sort of punitive actions that you hope to change behavior? Regime change, South Korea and Iran are not great examples of how sanctions cause regime change. The mullahs are still in Tehran after 20 years of sanctions. But the real question is, what can the West do? What line is to be trod between something that will punish Putin and something that will actually destabilize Russia? Now, we want Putin to change his behavior, we want Lukashenko to change his behavior, but we don't necessarily want to cause the economic collapse of Russia, or Belarus for that matter, for fear of something worse.
Okay, can you say a bit more about the relationship between the Kremlin and Belarus, though? Because to what extent can we see Lukashenko's behavior as being sanctioned by Putin? Is it conceivable that they really would have done this if the Kremlin hadn't wanted them? Of course, the Kremlin's going through the motions of saying how appalled they are, but is it really conceivable that they would have upset the apple cart, or Lukashenko would have behaved that way on his own?
That's not a question I can answer, and I don't think it's a question that anyone who is not inside the Russian or Belarusian governments can actually credibly answer. But it begs a different and more profound question, and that is, who orders this stuff? Who actually sort of puts out the death warrant for Sergei Skripal and sends out the GRU guys with their files of poison? Who actually sort of decided it's a good idea to down this Ryanair flight? I mean, we very often, I'm definitely guilty of this, but most journalists who write about Russia and Belarus, we say Putin as shorthand for Russia, Lukashenko as shorthand for Belarus. Yeah. But actually, there is a really strategic and an important question is, all these actions, all these egregious actions, including election hacking in the US, are the actions of the state's security services. Now, obviously, Putin is a former member of a security service. I mean, he's a child of the KGB. The KGB, the question is, do the security services, are they at the beck and call of Putin or Lukashenko, or are they semi-independent, or even worse, are they actually calling the shots? And that question is again, like very hard to answer because I think it's on a case by case basis. I mean, already, I mean, the closest we've had is there was an inquiry into the Litvinenko murder in 2007, and the Crown Prosecution Service concluded that there was strong evidence that Putin was personally involved in approving the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in 2007. There's also Theresa May said that apparently Putin ordered the Skripal poisoning, but again, we don't know that. And that's a real question for sanctions, because if we're talking about sanctions, we're talking about actions that influence policy. Now, are the actions of the security services actually a matter of policy, or are the security services actually doing what the hell they like? And I suspect that it's a sort of muddle of the two. I'm sure the security services, which in Belarus is touchingly still called the KGB, but the Belarusian actual literal KGB certainly didn't do this without Lukashenko's knowledge and approval. I'd be very surprised if that were the case. But on the other hand, was it they that cooked it up? Did they have any kind of idea? Could Lukashenko have stopped them? Maybe he could have. But the point is that actually it's that semi-independence between the notional center of power, Lukashenko and Putin, and the security services and their behavior. And that disconnect is actually, again, one of the reasons why sanctions is failing. Because
but right now, if this is the case then, and the West is out of options, and we've seen what we saw with South Africa, to an extent we've seen it with Iran, it's pretty difficult to look at the history of sanctions and point to places where they were really successful. They tended to weaken the country, to make the president or prime minister feel more embattled, and make it a bit easier for him to say, look at this terrible foreign joint enemy that we all share. Isn't the West terrible? Now, if it's the case that sanctions are there because we think something must be done in sanctions or something, what are our other tools? I mean, short of military action, is it simply the case that we are helpless and we pretty much might as well just admit it?
We're not helpless, because we could actually do much more if we chose to.
For example, what?
But to your point about Tehran, I mean, the Tehran government imprisoned an entire embassy full of U.S. diplomats. They're still they're still sending bombs and destabilizing Lebanon and Israel and Syria. I mean, frankly, but yet we're still talking to the Iranians. So even if you do go to the very end of the spectrum, which is you decide that Iran/Russia, Russia is a rogue state, like Iran is a rogue state, you cut off all economic ties, but you're still left with having to talk to them, to deal with them, and particularly on things like strategic arms, on terrorism and nuclear strategic weapons reduction treaties and so on. You still, Russia is, unfortunately, although it's economically rather weak, it's the 13th biggest economy in the world. It's smaller than South Korea's, but still it's strategically and militarily unignorable. So unfortunately, you can't really move further. I mean, you could, of course, if you chose to, make a strategic decision to completely shut down all economic ties to the West. But I think certainly the Biden administration, and people I've spoken to have been advisors also to Obama, the previous Democratic administration, their strategy is to essentially play a long game of sort of arm's length engagement rather than burn bridges.
Right, but this is a really important point, though, because you've got the Biden administration that are being tested. You could argue they're being tested by Hezbollah right now, what's happening in Israel. How far is Biden going to back Israel? You can argue that what we just saw in Belarus was perhaps the West under Biden's new leadership being tested. Just what will the Americans do there? Now, so far, it seems that Biden is a lot more, let's put it this way, predictable than Donald Trump. In opposition, when he was working under Obama, Biden, for example, didn't like the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline between Germany And Russia, he said it should be stopped when he gets into office. He hasn't done really anything to stop it at all. The Germans are going ahead with it. So Putin now gets to supply Germany with lots of gas. So Putin, as far as he's concerned, he's got this great big financial deal with Germany being done in defiance of the protest of the European Parliament and without Biden doing much to stop it. So I wonder if Biden is about to demonstrate to Putin and like-minded dictators around the world that old Donald Rumsfeld maxim that weakness is more provocative than strength.
Well, that's an excellent question, Fraser. But I would actually, but to that point, I would say that one of the key tactics for success of any asymmetric conflict is to provoke your stronger opponent into self-defeating acts of overreaction. That's how guerrillas win. That's, you saw it in Northern Ireland, you saw it in Algeria, you saw it. It's if you, and it's all about provocation. And if you actually cause your opponent to actually damage themselves, their credibility, their status, and so on, by provoking them into hasty actions, then you're winning that game. And I think that's a classic case of Hezbollah. Russia is harder because, indeed, as you rightly say, Germany is a problem. Germany has historically had by far the biggest economic ties, and certainly in terms of foreign direct investment, actually goes right back to Tsarist times. The Germans are very closely tied to Russia economically. Gerhard Schröder, the former Chancellor of Germany, was actually an advisor hired by Gazprom on the Nord Stream pipeline. The German political elite still hasn't made that step, but I think things are changing. In the specific case of Nord Stream 2, it's hard to know what more Biden could do, because already America has sanctioned all Western companies from participating in the construction. All of the final stages of construction is entirely Gazprom financed, in fact. So, I mean, unless you actually want to literally sanction Germany, which has and therefore, derail Biden's attempts to rebuild the sort of broken transatlantic relationship between the EU and Washington, you're not going to do that. It's not a big enough deal. And I think this is kind of the takeaway at the end of this. I mean, it's kind of outrageous. It's hooliganism. It's international. It's egregiously criminal behavior to try and poison British subjects. This is the Ryanair incident was an act of international airline piracy, but it's not as yet really big enough to warrant sort of a major strategic reshuffle. It's cheeky. It's outrageous. It does indeed show our weakness, but I would personally argue that a wise statesman would actually, unfortunately, choose the option of just sort of rolling eyes and going with symbolism rather than and long-term engagement, in the hope that Russia is actually going to eventually get back on within the fold of fully civilized nations, rather than confrontation, because there's really nothing the West can gain from confrontation. Because if Putin were, for instance, to be felled by crippling economic sanctions that derailed his regime and destabilized, I promise you, 1,000,000%, the successor will not be someone like Alexei Navalny. He will not be someone from the liberal opposition. It will be someone far scarier, far more nationalist, and far more dangerous. So unfortunately, you're right, the West seems impotent, but unfortunately, Lukashenko and Putin are sort of the devils that we know. And actually seriously destabilizing them risks something far worse and more dangerous.
Well, I guess all of this certainly makes international travel that much more unpredictable. Bernie, one of our cartoonists, has illustrated Owen's article in this week's magazine with a cartoon with a new Ryanair special offer saying, available now, Ryanair mystery tours as seen on TV. You never know where you will land. Owen, thanks very much indeed. Now from Belarus to Sweden, where the future of the monarchy is in question over there as it has been over here. Yet again, it's a dilemma of modernisation. Is the Swedish monarchy going woke? And if so, can the Swedes cope? Lisa Bjurwald answers this question in the magazine this week, and she joins me now. Now, Lisa, fascinating piece. You talk about a cast of characters that we might not be particularly knowledgeable about. There's Princess Sophia, Princess Victoria, Princess Madeleine. Can you tell us a little bit about the cast of characters in this royal drama?
Yes,
So just to sum up, so Crown Princess Victoria is the eldest one. She's the one who will become queen one day if the monarchy will survive this royal awakening, as we're going to talk about. And then you have Princess Sophia, who's married to Prince Carl Philip, poor guy who was destined to become king, but then we changed the whole thing around so women can become queens. So then he had to step back, so he's number 2 in line to the throne. And then there's Princess Madeline, married to an American, living in Florida at the moment. And they're all quite different characters. They're all modern princesses in their own way.
And Princess Victoria, you're saying that... And you say there's a convention in Sweden that the king... There's actually an understanding in Sweden that royals don't do politics. There was even a piece of the Swedish constitution prohibiting the king from talking about politics. But you say that Victoria, the Crown Princess, has been, for example, speaking in pride marches and being active, I don't know if you might call it a civic way, but in things that aren't party politics. But she's found another way to pass her commentary on social issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting because this is such a fine line to be threading. I mean, is she making a political statement? I mean, she's not making a political statement from left to right, but she's certainly making some kind of statement by, as you say, speaking at pride marches and joining a demonstration of the Me Too movement, for example. It works so far because Sweden in general is a very woke country. It's seen as something very natural to be committed to civic society, to donate money each month to charities and such. But the question is, how far can they go? I mean, they are constantly pushing these borders. Princess Sophia has been running a foundation for children in Africa. Not controversial at all, but now she's founded a foundation with her husband, Prince Carl Philip, against internet bullying. And this is, of course, much more of a hot potato than helping poverty-stricken children.
Right, and also we know that Prince Charles in this country, when he was young, he wrote a book, The Old Man in Loch Nagar. It was a children's book, which I remember my parents bought for me. And Princess Madeline has also written a children's book, but with a rather different plot twist, you say?
Yes, I think all of us journalists here, when we were sent out these review copies of Stella and the Secret, we assumed it would be something about, unicorns or dolls or fairies or standing up for yourself. Like generally, vague but sort of sweet children's book aimed at young girls, but it turned out it was actually about incest, a rather more unexpected topic.
So that was The Secret, and Stella and the Secret. The Secret.
That is The Secret. It's not like she's got a secret diary that can fly or something like that. It's incest, so it's a bit awkward. But she has been active for many years, just like her mother, Queen Sylvia, in these foundations that work against sexual abuse against children. So she does have that genuine commitment, or have a genuine, it is going to some gala dinner in New York once a year, I have no idea. But she does have it on paper that this is not it's not something you just grab like, I'm going to write a book about incest. There is that genuine attachment on this issue. The question is just, should royals be doing this? Does she have the competence, as, for example, a child psychiatrist would, to bring up these issues? Or is it just a way of classic virtue signalling? I'm leaning towards the latter.
But is this causing any kind of kickback in Sweden? I noticed an article in Svensk Dagbladet a few weeks ago asking if Sweden was ready for its woke monarchy. So are Swedes noticing a changing pattern in behaviour, about the younger royals are being, socially active in a way that perhaps they weren't a generation ago?
Yeah, I think so, and I think it's also lots of it, because it's just, it's more and more frequent. So if it's once every 10 years, you wouldn't really notice. But first it was like the Me Too, autumn of 2017, then you have this children's book, you have this foundation against internet bullying, Then you had Crown Princess Victoria speaking at Stockholm Fashion Week against damaging ideals and so on. And she has famously been suffering from eating disorders as well.
And she was in Stockholm Fashion Week. She was talking about the need for diversity, ethnic diversity, I guess, in the modelling industry. So here she is taking a stand on equality in an industry. That's perhaps.
And again, it's like if you want to look at it from a positive point of view, you could say she's got her own experience from eating disorders. It's great that she's standing up for allowing women of all sizes to exist. But then on the other hand, it's like, how ethnically diverse is the Swedish royal family? They're all just like, white upper class people. So it's a bit. There's always that fine line, between doing good work and being slightly hypocritical about it. And the same goes for the Me Too movement and her involvement there, of course, since her father, King Carl Gustaf, has been accused of, untowardly behavior, or however you would say it, against women. He famously just said to journalists, let's not mention this again, let's not talk about it. And Swedish journalists were like, okay, let's never bring it up again.
It's interesting because Prince Harry recently did a podcast which he made great waves. He was trashing the American Constitution, for example, saying he thought the free speech protection was bonkers. And a few weeks ago, we have the Swedish king himself giving an interview to a podcast, which must be a turn-up for the book. So was he dropping Harry-style bombs during that conversation?
Unfortunately not, but I think just the fact that he was on such a trendy podcast, which usually just have celebrities and journalists and writers, influencers, actresses and so on as guests, and you suddenly have the king, this was absolutely unexpected, and it's certainly one more step towards total wokedom, I'd say.
But do the Swedish royals need to do this because they feel that they're not popular enough with the young, that they're not connected enough with the country? Is there a kind of strategy behind this? Are they worried about their standing?
I think they're just really trying to stay relevant. I think they're nervous. Our king has downsized the monarchy, just as has been the case in the UK and other countries, just slimlining it, focusing on just him and the heir, Crown Princess Victoria, and her daughter in official photographs and such. As you will remember, Queen Elizabeth has done with Prince William and his eldest son, wasn't it? That kind of... Or was it Prince Charles and William and the Queen? Yeah, but he's done the same kind of image all over, just to show that we don't really cost as much money. Because that kind of criticism is all new in Sweden. It's only been in the last few years that it's come up again, that are they really worth the money? And this is what it all comes down to, isn't it? Are they worth the taxpayers' money? Or if they're just going to go and be woke like any Instagram influencers, what's the difference? Why can't they just go out and do that on their own? Why do they need their palaces, the diplomatic immunity, fancy titles, and all of these advantages? Right. That's what it all comes down to, like making a case for your own existence, really.
Right. But is there a feeling, is this actually upsetting anybody? I mean, what is woke to one person might be simple common sense to another. There might be, of course, the royals will say, the Queen's Christmas message in this country, she always talks about the need for family, community. Maybe if you're talking about the need for diversity and equality, you're simply expressing what is nowadays a commonly accepted virtue.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. And I think royals doing good is a good thing. I mean, we've had royals like Marie Antoinette and that type of royal bearing down on humanity for centuries. So royals that kind of want to do too much good should be a good thing. But again, it's that fine balance between being some sort of superior, silent beings, a remnant from the past that we use to promote our countries and so on, and just going full-on celebrity. Right. I mean, it's such a fine balance. I mean, because they shouldn't really be here, should they? They shouldn't be here in 2021. They're saying that they have a magical, special bloodline, that they are in direct connection with God. It's a complete anomaly in the modern world, and we all know this. So they have to be modern, but they can't be offensively modern. And as we've seen in the case with Prince Harry, of course, he's gone full on Los Angeles, woke, new age type celebrity, and that hasn't worked. So we'll see if the Swedish royal family can balance it a bit better and just do kind of slow modernization. But it seems like now they're getting all eyes on them. Like, what is there some kind of silent woke revolution going on here?
Right, but one final question. Princess Madeleine, she sounds a bit like Harry. I think she's about the same age as him. Like him, she decided to marry an American and go off and live on the other side of the world. So has she been, I don't know, giving Oprah interviews, giving some home trips about the royal family? How has she been behaving? Because she effectively has opted out of the Swedish royal circle in the same way that Harry wanted to opt out of ours.
I know, and the interesting thing is that her opting out seems so much more genuine, because she's like, yes, no reporters, I'll just, I'll do a bit of work on my foundations, like a normal wealthy Florida housewife, really, taking care of the kids with the help of umpteenth staff and swimming in her swimming pool, whatever. Whereas Harry's like, please leave us alone, and then he's seeking attention all the time. So his message is totally conflicting, but she has never ever been seen as interested in royal work. Absolutely. So this is like a logical development, and this is also why the king has decided to like cut down on her official duties, and she can just be one of the many like minor European royals hanging out somewhere else in the world, jet setting and stuff.
And do you think we can expect more of this? Do you think the Swedish royals are getting into a trend that they think they're renewing their relevance now and they're going to be championship? Can we expect more podcast appearances by the king? I mean, recently he said that Sweden's COVID response had been a mistake. That made worldwide attention by people who think that he meant that Sweden's lockdowns were a mistake. He said he was talking in general terms. But it seems to me as if they're dipping their toes into this water a lot more than they would be a few years ago.
Absolutely they are. And I think it's interesting to watch all of the Scandinavian, the Norwegian and the Swedish and the Danish monarchies. Sometimes the Danish monarchy is called a bicycle monarchy. I don't know if you've heard that expression. Literally because they ride their bicycles around Copenhagen, and which is the same kind of monarchy that we have in Sweden and in Norway. They're out in the street. They're not show-offs. They don't wear haute couture or drive insanely expensive sports cars or anything like that. They're like a down-to-earth type of royal. But yet again, if you go too woke, it will be like, okay, so you're really down-to-earth, you don't like anything of this fancy life, you just want to work for charities and you just want to save the children. Well, just drop your royal titles and live like a normal Svensson or Anderson. Why don't you? That's the end question always, isn't it? But they don't really want to do that. They want to have the royal cake and eat it.
And it's the governing principle of our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. Lisa Bjurwald, thank you very much for taking us through the magical world of Swedish royalty. Now that's it from Spectator TV this week. If you'd like to avail yourself of our special offer, you get £20 if you pay £12 for a 3-month subscription to The Spectator in print and online. If you do the maths, you'll find out that works out as -8. And how the marketing department passed that one, I just don't know. But anyway, you can take it on spectator.co.uk/TV offer. Thanks very much for watching The Week in 60 Minutes, and thanks to our producers Cindy Yu and Max Jeffrey. Cindy Yu herself will be back presenting next week.